Hello, everyone, and welcome to Midcast, an interview series featuring dissenting voices the establishment would rather silence. I'm your host, Manar Mohawish Adli. To help us continue these interview series, we invite you to become a member of our Patreon, which we will link in the video below. As an independent watchdog media outlet that exposes the corruption of the ruling class and the attacks on our civil liberties, we are facing major censorship and shadow banning by social media tech giants. And that's why we ask you to share our videos and help fund our projects as we stand up to the war machine. World leaders are now gathered in Glasgow for the COP26 climate conference, where plans for the future of the world are being made. Activists from around the planet have descended upon the city, pressing governments to enact real change rather than offering simple bromides to the issue. Yet behind all the fanfare, and away from the cameras, other figures are attempting to hash out a new global economic system that intends to profit from ecological collapse, transforming financial rules and eroding national sovereignty. We're talking about the most powerful private financial interests in the world under the cover of COP26. They have developed a plan to transform the global financial system by fusing with institutions like the World Bank and IMF, using them to further erode national sovereignty in the developing world. Now, to add on to this, a project of the multilateral development banking system, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the New York Stock Exchange recently created a new asset class that will put not just the natural world, but the processes underpinning all life up for sale under the guise of promoting sustainability. These are the same institutions and wealthy individuals who are tied to similar pushes for central bank digital currencies and biometric digital IDs. Now, joining us to discuss this today is Whitney Webb. Whitney was formerly senior investigative reporter for Press News and currently writes for The Last American Vagabond and Unlimited Hangout. Whitney has been monitoring this very closely and written 2 investigations on the subject. Whitney, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Manar. It's my pleasure.
So while the cameras have focused on the big names gathering in Glasgow, global financial corporations have basically been meeting in an attempt to remodel the global financial system under the guise of helping the environment. But as you write, these changes would erode national sovereignty around the world and lock poor countries into poverty for good. Can you put this in more simple terms and explain to us what exactly is going on?
Yeah, it's actually even worse than what you just laid out. So basically what's going on is that you're having not just private corporations and private financial institutions planning this out behind the scenes, but also the world's billionaires, people like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Larry Fink, Mike Bloomberg, are all directly involved in these efforts. As individuals and launching their own different initiatives, sort of promoting their business interests and business interests of Wall Street specifically. So in terms of their efforts to remake and change the global financial system, this basically boils down to an alliance that was actually launched in April with the plans to have it have their first 6-month progress report launched at the same time as COP26. It was originally launched by John Kerry, who's a U.S. Special Envoy for Climate Change, and also Janet Yellen, who's the Secretary of the Treasury under Biden, in coordination with the UK government, and Mark Carney, who's the former head of the Central Bank of both England and Canada, and is the UN Envoy currently for Climate Action and Finance. That's his current title, but he's also a special advisor to UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson for COP26. And this alliance is called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And it's comprised of several different subgroups that are, they all have different acronyms and names, but they have net zero in there, like the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which represents 43% of all global banking assets in the world. Definitely a formidable group. Also, a group of asset managers, which includes BlackRock and some of the biggest asset managers of the world, and also asset owners. Definitely a significant amount, if not the majority, of the world's private financial powers. Are operating under the guises of this group, which has been publicly promoted at COP26, specifically by politicians and private sector leaders, I guess you could say, as necessary as a planetary imperative. But if you look at how John Kerry, for example, framed this, he said basically what this alliance is the world's banks uniting behind the push to net zero, which first and foremost they see as a vast commercial opportunity, and then secondarily as a planetary imperative. Well, if something is a planetary imperative, you would assume it would be first, and the vast commercial opportunity would come second, but he doesn't phrase it that way. I think that's pretty telling. And if you go and read the progress report of this alliance, it's quite clear that in there they describe what they've done over the past 6 months, but most of the focus is on their what they call a program for work for transforming the financial system in the short term and their near term ambitions. And it's quite clear reading that this is really just using net zero, decarbonization, and climate change rhetoric as cover for something very, very nefarious. And there's a couple different elements to what they want to do. So one you mentioned in your intro has to do with the multilateral development banking system. The World Bank, other groups like the Inter-American Development Bank, there's a lot of MDBs, multilateral development banks that are regionally based. But basically, the focus of this group of the most powerful financial interests in the world is specifically on emerging markets and developing countries, the global South. And the more you look into it, the more obvious it becomes that this is really a neo-colonialist endeavor. In the context of what they want to do with multilateral development banks, they say what they want to push for is a fusion of these private sector interests represented by the alliance with multilateral development banks. And this is obviously not a good idea. We know, for example, that these banks have been acknowledged in leaked U.S. military documents as being unconventional financial weapons used as instruments of U.S. national power and imperial power. And the fact that, they want to maintain the same dirty tactics, you could say, of these banks that the World Bank and the IMF and these other groups have been criticized for. Instead of having those be instruments of national power, of U.S. imperialism, they want to make it instruments of power for Wall Street directly. You could argue that Wall Street obviously exercises a lot of influence over U.S. national policy, and thus, it being the IMF or World Bank being instruments of U.S. national power does have a connection to Wall Street in that sense, and that's true. But what they're doing is they're cutting the government out of the middle and just making them basically financial weapons for Wall Street private interests targeting developing countries. And they're very explicit about this in the report, saying that basically what they want these banks to do is to force governments to adopt business enabling environments that enable investment, make them more friendly to investment from alliance members. Their ambitions in the country specifically as part of this, using this planetary imperative, this urgency around climate change as the pretext. So previously, these banks used debt as a way to force developing countries to implement policies they normally wouldn't implement, right, that were against their national interests in a lot of cases. And instead of using debt, what they're looking to do here is the urgency of climate change, the urgency of adopting a net zero economy as a way to sort of force these investments through. And some of these investments are not environmentally friendly at all. And I can give some examples of that later. But for example, this alliance right now, while it was launched by John Kerry, Janet Yellen, and Mark Carney, it's currently led by Mark Carney and Mike Bloomberg, for example. And looking at Bloomberg's own investments in net zero technology, it's very clear that this is not going to be something that benefits the planet or the people of in emerging markets and developing countries. It's definitely a neo-colonialist venture.
Right. So you've basically described this new neo-colonialist endeavor to, transform the financial markets and the way that these already what we would refer to as weapons of empire, the IMF and the World Bank. How exactly is this going to affect Indigenous communities who are already affected by climate crisis?
Okay, so there's a lot of different ways this is going to impact communities, so Indigenous communities. So one big example is that, whereas in the past, the past model of the IMF and the World Bank, you would see debt used against countries as a way to get them to privatize state-owned assets, for example, right? Or implement unpopular austerity policies. What they're looking to do with this is to get developing countries to privatize their natural assets, because Wall Street is currently in the midst of having recently launched a new investment vehicle called natural asset corporations, with a specific focus on Latin America and in coordination with the multilateral development banking system that these same bankers want to reimagine. Essentially, what they want to be able to do is take ownership of the natural assets of countries, specifically in Latin America, because that was the regional development bank they partnered with. And this venture in Costa Rica is their pilot country for this. But essentially what they want to do is create natural asset corporations that own the rights to ecosystem services produced by a quantity of land, and then license access to the products or to what's produced by those services to the public. And that is, it's really insane. When you look at the nuts and bolts of it, because it basically opens the door for foreign interests to basically become owners of things like the air or clean water and things like that in the developing world, and then charge people living there for their access to it, and also presumably exporting those assets abroad and things like this. And this is just a way to greatly extend the existing Wall Street casino, because this is them creating a new asset class that, in describing the opportunity, as they call it, of this asset class of creating natural assets that up until this point had been excluded from the financial system. They're able to greatly increase the amount of assets available in the existing economy. Estimates of the asset classes currently included in the economy are like 512 trillion. And they say by including natural assets and creating nature's economy, that they'll be able to unlock 4 quadrillion in assets. And this is just has nothing to do with protecting the planet and everything to do with extending, basically creating a global neo-feudal framework in this new financial system that they're hammering out at COP26, and it's being admitted in their documents, and it's getting really no coverage at all. And what's very troubling is that you're having sort of faces of the climate change movement, like Greta Thunberg, saying things like, the UN has to declare an emergency and all of this stuff, even though the UN is backing these same policies that are Wall Street driven.
Is that in your investigation, you actually break down how the UN has been transformed over the last 20 years to basically become a weapon being used or a tool, I should say, by this billionaire class, the very entities that you mentioned in the banking systems, to promote these things. So when Greta Thunberg comes out and says we need to use the UN, what does that really, really mean?
Okay, well, it's really problematic because there's a big difference these days between what the public perception of the United Nations is and how the United Nations actually functions in practice. So, this Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero that I just talked about, some of the most predatory banking interests in the world who have directly announced predatory plans for the developing countries, that is an industry-led, UN-convened alliance, right? So they have the official backing of the United Nations. So if the United Nations, given the prevailing public perception, that's supposed to be the UN works with national governments, and there's international consensus between national governments, and most of those national governments are democracies, ergo it's sort of like a way of developing democratic international consensus, right? That's the prevailing public perception of how the UN works. So if that's the case, why would they back an alliance that really only benefits Wall Street and some of these billionaires involved, like Mike Bloomberg? But if you actually look at what's been going on at the UN over the past several decades, it's quite clear that this is just business as usual at the UN these days. In my piece, I quote from a speech given by the then head of the UN, then Secretary General Kofi Annan, gave a speech to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, which is basically a meeting of the world's, biggest billionaires and business leaders and politicians and all this stuff all coming together. And at this particular meeting in 1998, I'll just read the quote because, it's very telling that he says it this way. He says, "The United Nations has been transformed since we last met here in Davos. The organization has undergone a complete overhaul that I have described as a quiet revolution. A fundamental shift has occurred. The United Nations once dealt only with governments, and this, of course, is still the public perception. But he goes on to say, by now we know that peace and prosperity cannot be achieved without partnerships involving governments, international organizations, the business community, and civil society. The business of the United Nations involves the businesses of the world." So that's his quote, essentially. And really what we've seen happen over time is that the UN has become a huge vehicle for public-private partnerships, as they're called, which puts private capital, private corporations on equal footing with the national governments, and also what's sometimes referred to as the stakeholder capitalist model, which essentially functions in that same way through public-private sector collaborative vehicles. But in practice, what happens is that it basically gives corporations in the private sector a greater role in policy making, and they essentially use that to form the regulations and laws governing their own markets, and greatly reduces the role that national governments actually play. And if you look at some UN documents that came out after this speech by Kofi Annan in 1998, they basically say that the role of national governments at the UN today is to create enabling environments for these often industry-led or industry-designed policies. And we see that, of course, with this Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. They say the role of governments is to create enabling environments, and if they won't do so on their own, we'll use the multilateral development banking system, the IMF and the World Bank, to force them to do so. That's essentially what's going on here.
And so with this kind of transfer of power out of the hands of government and into the hands of multinational corporations, very corrupt banking systems, and the hands of this billionaire, trillionaire class, I guess we can call them now, we are, if we haven't already, moving in the direction of what could be described as corporatism or fascism. Where do we see society heading in this direction in terms of civil liberties?
In a very, very bad direction, obviously. I think that should be pretty clear to everyone. What you're having are private sector interests attempting through efforts like this to redesign. In this case, we're talking about the financial system, but these same forces are also looking to redesign other sectors of society, as under the guise of different emergencies, different crises, taking advantage of crises and public concern over those crises to basically hammer through what is really the framework for a neo-feudalist society. And it's no coincidence that you have a lot of these same entities that are pushing for these sorts of policies under the guise of climate change. They're also promoting things like what they call the fourth industrial revolution, an effort to automate jobs. There's also a lot of Silicon Valley involvement while they're launching the so-called metaverse. And all of this stuff is going on at the same time. And really what a lot of these initiatives boil down to is efforts by Western capital, and also capital from China, Russia, and other countries to create new markets and keep the casino going, essentially. But obviously there's a lot more to it as well.
Well, and under the guise of COVID-19 now, the establishment has created this sort of crisis to push for central bank digital currencies and pushing for vaccine, passports.
Right.
These are the same people that are pushing these ideas, which essentially do expand surveillance and do crush more of our civil liberties. And so we're kind of moving in that direction already. So just to put it into kind of relatable terms, how are we already seeing these things kind of being pushed now in terms of the COVID-19 crisis or pandemic, I should say?
Okay, well, the things that you brought up, like the digital ID stuff, the biometric digital ID is something that's existed. There's been a major policy push for this by a lot of these same groups going back to 2014, and then coming into its own in a big way in 2016 with the launch of something called the ID 2020 Alliance. Which was mainly, again, the Rockefeller Foundation, who were behind really these natural asset corporations that I mentioned earlier in coordination with Silicon Valley companies, essentially. And they have a direct tie as founding members to the World Economic Forum's Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And what a lot of that has to do is also about remaking the economy. And people may have heard that the post-oil economy, its data is the new oil, right? And so a lot of what this has to do with is the centralization of who controls your data in an increasingly digital world. And under the guise of COVID-19, there's been a broad push to digitize essentially everything, but specifically the economy and essentially the foundation of the system that they are already implementing and seek to expand even further is this biometric digital ID system that obviously has a huge surveillance component to it, as you mentioned as well. But basically all of your online activities and everything you do in the digital space is tied directly to your digital ID that's based on biometrics, whether it's an iris scan or a palm scan, fingerprints, facial recognition. There's different ways it's been implemented. ID 2020 tends to use iris scans in their pilot programs. They have basically all of their pilot programs that took place before COVID-19. They've done on very vulnerable populations, specifically refugees, giving refugees in places like Syria and Myanmar or stateless people. In those areas, the choice between surrendering their biometric data for an experiment by Silicon Valley essentially, or getting food aid. Basically, do you want to eat or will you participate in our pilot program? And it's very telling. They tend to pilot these types of programs on increasingly vulnerable populations where people don't have a choice.
Right, they're tested on vulnerable people first. People in the global south, people who are homeless, who are so desperate. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Yeah. And so basically what the goal of that system is, though, is to have a centralized players, a certain group of people with control over the data that is being generated at an ever increasing pace because of the increased digitizing of the economy. So basically, if data is the new oil, the people that own the data and control the flow of the data and the access to that data are going to be sort of like the oil barons of this new industrial revolution era. Whereas, the first industrial revolution had to do with, the advent of hydrocarbons, and people like the Rockefeller family, for example, became America's first billionaires and all of this stuff because of their control of oil assets during that period. Similarly, there are interests that want to have that same position for themselves in this new increasingly digital era that they refer to as the Fourth Industrial Revolution. But it has a lot of very insanely bad, for lack of a better term, implications for civil liberties. And central bank digital currencies are the financial side to that, because the idea is to have those also tied to this foundational digital ID infrastructure, but with the idea of allowing central banks to impose requirements or restrictions or monitoring of people's financial activity. And ways, you mentioned earlier, ways we're already seeing this. In the UK, France, I believe, Australia, and I think they've talked about it in the US as well. There is, for example, a push to link your ID, your government-issued ID, to your internet activity or to your social media accounts. This is being pushed in the UK, I know right now, specifically through something they're calling David's Law. where they basically want to have, if you want to access social media, you just sign up with a government issued ID, the same exact ID program that was previously promoted by Tony Blair and was very controversial because of its surveillance applications. Or potential uses or abuses. They basically want to use that same system and connect it to social media accounts. But then, once they do that, they can connect it to a lot of other things, including there's actually the UK government, the Israeli government, the US government are part of something called the Partnership Against Cybercrime, which actually seeks to have those identities not just tied to your social media accounts, but literally everything you do online and also your financial activity online. So it's basically designed, if it's allowed to progress, to eliminate any sort of ability to have privacy in your online or financial life. And that's really the types of systems and plans that are being implemented en masse globally under the guise of combating COVID-19 or combating climate change. We're seeing more often than not the solutions tend to be along this route. But it is quite obvious in the case of climate change to see that a lot of these solutions have very little to do with sustainability. In the case of oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I can come back to it if you give me a second. Sorry.
Okay. And when people are being pushed into this new biometric digital ID system that connects their financials, their internet activity, if they don't participate or if there's like a technical glitch or something, that can remove their access, that person's access to things like their own money and their ability to buy food, for example. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, and this has happened in places like India. They have a system there that's sort of like this digital biometric ID system. I think they call it Andhar, something like that. And people have been, because of glitches in the system, have been denied access to essential food and have actually starved to death as a result. And unfortunately, the interest behind these frame this as, it's going to make things more equitable. It's going to give developing countries more opportunities, but we're really seeing it act in very much the opposite way. And so it's increasingly important for people to be vigilant about what the sales pitches are of these systems and how they actually function in practice. And more often than not, a lot of these systems are promoted by the same group of billionaires, a lot of them tied to Silicon Valley, like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and some of these other individuals that are increasingly backing and promoting these systems. There's a huge difference between how they promote these systems and how they actually affect the people in the places where they are implemented.
And we're seeing huge pushback, though, against these biometric digital IDs, vaccine passports, especially when it comes to children. We're seeing pushback all around the world. We barely see any coverage when it comes to mainstream corporate media. I mean, if it weren't for like viral videos that go viral on social media, we probably wouldn't even hear about them. But do you think that there will be enough pushback to roll back these kinds of initiatives? Like, what are you seeing right now?
Well, where I live in Chile, there's a vaccine passport system and not a lot of pushback at all. But I think a lot of that has to do with the media landscape here. It's completely dominated by mainstream media. There really is no independent media functioning here. That is critical of these systems. So I think a lot of it, that's why you see a lot of these protests take place more often than not in English-speaking countries because of the diversity of the media landscape, at least for now. I mean, obviously, censorship is making it a lot harder these days, but I think ultimately the way to challenge the inherent problems of these systems is to really separate it from the debate of the vaccines themselves, that it's really irrelevant at this point what you think about the COVID-19 vaccines, their efficacy and their safety and whatnot, because regardless of what you think about that, the vaccine passport system is something that is being ushered in as currently a vaccine passport system, but it's planned to be something much more extensive than that. It goes from COVID-19 vaccines to all vaccines to your entire electronic health records in a matter of steps. And we're really not that far away from that taking place. And then you're having it linked to that, but also your social media access, your online activities, your purchases online, your accessing of e-government services. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And really having this being this is just a dream come true for surveillance interests. It was actually planned out. Some of the infrastructure of this was planned out as part as a post 9/11 war on terror surveillance system planned for use domestically in the U.S. by the Pentagon's DARPA called Total Information Awareness, which was so controversial at the time because it would eliminate privacy and civil liberties. It was said by critics at the time that it was scrapped by Congress a few months after it launched. But really, these digital IDs, if they're allowed to expand and grow, will become very much the same in terms of its utility regarding surveillance to the national security state. And it's very alarming to see a lot of people on the left supporting that policy, because it's really something that even top officials, the chief medical officers of Wales, the health minister of Israel, these guys have been either caught on hot mics or publicly said, the epidemiological justification for vaccine passports is really minimal. What it's meant to do is to incentivize vaccination. Really, at this point, the people that aren't going to take the vaccine aren't going to take it. So in terms of its utility in that sense, it's really, I would argue, come to an end. So what really, why are they keeping it going? Isn't this supposed to be a temporary measure? It's obviously becoming permanent in several countries or moving towards that way. In the case of Chile, where I live, they have just in the past couple months been moving the goalposts on what you have to do in order to keep your vaccine passport valid. If they just determine that you violate a series of policies, they're able to change at their whim. They can deactivate yours even if you're fully vaccinated. That doesn't really sound like a system that's focused necessarily on health. It seems like a system that's focused with behavioral modification and control of a domestic population.
And when it comes to the left, I mean, I've never seen so many people on the left cheer on big pharma. Whether you support a vaccine or not, that is irrelevant. It's irrelevant. People should still have the choice, especially when it comes to looking at the actual numbers of how COVID is affecting young people, children. I mean, these are the people that probably don't have to take a vaccine, but they're supporting vaccine mandates, vaccine passports, which all in turn, as you just described in this entire conversation, really benefits digitizing our information. It benefits big pharma profits. It benefits the 1% billionaire class, moving our financial systems in a new direction of even more and further exploitation. Whitney, thank you so much for joining us today. I don't know if I feel like less hopeful after this conversation or like what, but that really hit me hard, everything that you talked about. So I really appreciate you joining me today. And we're gonna talk more about this in another interview, hopefully in the coming weeks. But thank you for covering this, and thank you for always being so outspoken about these issues.
No, absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity to bring these issues to the attention of your audience.
Thank you so much.